Good morning, everyone. What a pleasure and a delight to be with you. Usually I start with a commute story. No commute stories this morning. This is going to be, as I've been thinking about it, a little more like what in history was called a fireside chat. Whether you were old enough to remember them personally or you read about them in history books. It was a time when the late President Roosevelt would speak to the American public on the radio because it was a challenging time. It was a time of economic stress. It was a time of war. And I thought to myself, gosh golly, Proverbs does say there's nothing new under the sun. And I said, so this morning's talk is somewhat in the nature of a fireside chat. I would like us to think of it as that way. I want to thank Jackie for the beautiful rendition of Weave. She and I agreed immediately that would be the perfect hymn for this morning because its message is so clear. In God's infinite diversity, there is a oneness. And I want to thank Mark for his choice of the spiritual reading this morning. And if you forgive me while I diddle with my phone here so I can bring it back, I think the statement in it that was so powerful for me is being in this moment, we can open ourselves to spirit within and contemplate cherishing. And I thought to myself, cherishing. Wow, I don't know that I've heard the word cherish, certainly not in church, for quite a long time. I thought maybe we don't do enough cherishing. And I thought that this morning we could do some cherishing. And the reason I thought of that is when I was prowling through my calendar, my little day timer, several weeks ago, in the last month actually, maybe even before that, I looked at it and I went, oh my goodness. The three Abrahamic religions all have a major holiday in the month of April. Now, you may not be familiar with that word Abrahamic. It's Abraham with an IC on the end. And it refers to the religions that perceive the biblical character Abraham as their patriarch. And in the order of their expression in our universe, that would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All three of those religions accept and revere and esteem Abraham as a patriarch. And what is a patriarch? Someone who teaches us how to be more than we imagine ourselves capable of being. A patriarch is one who can be a leader. We often say, well, so-and-so is the patriarch of the family. And of course, being equal, we could also say so-and-so is the matriarch of a family. But today we look at Abraham and we look at these three religions. Now, you may be wondering what I'm talking about because you probably looked at the calendar and went, oh, goody, Easter Sunday is April 17th. And yes, it is, because that's our tradition. That is the holiday or the event that we celebrate as Christians. But I looked at the calendar and went, oh my gosh. In two of these traditions, the day that is celebrated starts at sundown. So yesterday, Saturday evening, April 2nd, the month of Ramadan began for our Muslim brothers and sisters. This is a month, exactly 30 days, in which people do not eat or drink. That means no food, no water between sunrise and sunset. Yeah, think about that for a moment. Some of us have done that because we wanted to lose weight, or some of us did it because we were on some kind of crazy diet, or some of us did it for whatever reason. Within the Muslim tradition, people are doing it to become more aware of God and more present to the spirituality within which they live. Hold that thought for a moment. Then I looked further into the calendar and I went, goodness gracious, the 15th of April. Now, my secular calendar says Good Friday. And the next day, on the 16th, it says Passover. And I thought, yes, but this is another religion that begins at sunset. So on the eve of Good Friday is the first day of Passover. And I thought there is such a congruence in the universe. We really need to look into it. And then, of course, on the 17th, it is Easter Sunday, the premier holiday in the Christian tradition, equal only to Christmas, which we allude to as the birth of Jesus. For those of you who are really into calendars, and most of us aren't, we'll also notice that on the 24th of April, the following Sunday, is what is known as Orthodox Easter Sunday, which means in Russia and the Ukraine especially, and the other Orthodox Christian churches, which use a calendar that puts their Easter a week after ours. And I thought, how wonderful. The whole human family has an opportunity to celebrate, each in their own way, our oneness. I'd like to read something by the late Bishop John Shelby Spong, who was the Episcopal Bishop of the Diocese of Newark, New Jersey. He has passed away recently. This is from an article which I took from a Unity magazine, written by Reverend Thomas Shepard, whose name you may recognize. He was on the faculty and writes for Unity. Bishop Spong writes, I have great respect for the Unity movement. I believe Unity is in the vanguard of calling Christianity into a new self-understanding. This movement is deeply life-affirming, not life-denying. It does not wallow in sin, but rather celebrates life. It also recognizes that there are many pathways to God and that none is evil. I have been greatly enriched by my close association with Unity over the years. I was extremely fortunate to have heard him speak publicly, probably 5 or 6 times, occasionally at the Unity Annual Conference for Clergy and in also educational venues. I also had the privilege of speaking to him personally, and he was such a down-to-earth person. When I first met him, wanting to be correct, I looked at him and I said, excuse me, do I call you your grace or your eminence or once or what? And he said, just call me Jack. Jack Spong is perfect. A very down-to-earth man who recognized his humanity and his spirituality. And that's what I would like us to take as a model, to look at our humanity and our spirituality. We know from Genesis 1:26, it says that God created humankind in God's image and likeness. That means that God put its spirit into the living being that we call a human being. But God is spirit, and we worship God in spirit. And what I have found in my 35 years in ministry is that most human beings, if they are willing to acknowledge it, have a desire to experience their spirituality. and a desire to celebrate it in their humanity. It is unity which very clearly says, I am a spiritual being having a human experience. For a long time, most of us walked around thinking we were a human being having an occasional spiritual experience, maybe for 90 minutes on a Sunday morning or some other time. But we have come to understand that with our principle, there is only one power, one presence in the universe, God, the good, omnipotent, that we are all united in the one. And therefore, the words which Mark read earlier in the service, when he spoke of cherishing, it says, to be cherished is to be cared for and nurtured. I am an individual, a unique expression of God. There is our unity foundation, who is cherished by my Creator. Knowing that I am being cared for and loved by God, I have confidence. I can do more and be more through the awareness that God loves me. And continuing, it says, I am God's life in expression. I am God's love and expression. I am God's light and expression. I am God's light in expression. And from Job chapter 32, verse 8, it says, truly it is the spirit in a mortal, the breath of the Almighty that makes for understanding. It's why we say when we begin a time of prayer or meditation, breathing in and breathing out. Breath is spirit, and it unites us. Friends, all people breathe the same way. All people need oxygen. Every living thing needs oxygen. Your cat, your dog, your parakeet. All of the living creatures in the ground and above the ground require oxygen. It is given to human beings to also have the power to engage in thought and therefore be united in God. So, excuse me. As I looked at this calendar, I recalled really my experiences with these three religions. I'll begin with Ramadan because, as I said, it started last night. It goes for 30 days, during which from sunup to sundown, there is no eating. This occurred when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Turkey. And my neighbors and colleagues at school said to me, you know, Ramadan, blah, 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 is starting. And I said, yes, I know. And you won't be eating. And don't worry, I won't be eating in front of you. And then one took me aside and said, you know, we know that you and your roommate have an occasional bottle of wine. And I thought, yes, I bet they know everything we buy in this small town. And they said, now there won't be any alcohol sold during this time, so you might want to stock up. And I thought, well, thank you. I'll take that under advisement. And I thought that was a kindness on their part. And no, Rosie and I did not go out and buy a ton of bottles of stuff and bring them home and stash them. But what we were was very careful in our observance of our neighbors and our friends. However, the one shocking thing occurred the next morning. Just before, about an hour and a half before sunrise, which means at that time it was about 4:00 in the morning, there was a group of musicians outside of the front of the house where we were living on the lower level. And one of them was beating a really, really big drum loudly, like any football parade you've ever seen. And the other one was playing an instrument called a zurna, which is like a really loud and shrill clarinet. And the other one was playing something else, making a real racket. Well, she and I flew out of bed. It was like, oh my gosh, what is this? When we got to school that day, we said, this is what happened. And they said, oh yeah, well, that's this band goes around and wakes up everybody so they have time to eat their breakfast before sunup. And I thought, how kind, how interesting, how very interesting. Of course, there's a end of the story. At the end of the 30 days, they came around and knocked on the door. What they wanted was a tip. Can you pay us? We woke you up every day. And my thought was, yeah, but we didn't want to be woken up every day. But we gave them something, anything, anyway. I cherish that memory. I cherish also the break the fast meals that I was invited to, where I sat with people who treated me like family. So then we move on. We move on to that Good Friday. And I'm going to not explore Good Friday because I'll do that when I do Easter. The next event, or the next holiday for God's people, is first night of Passover. Very interestingly, Passover also deals with restrictions of food. During that time, Jewish people eat matzah, which is a tasteless, unleavened cracker. I know they've tried to doctor them up over the years, but friends, a tasteless, unleavened cracker is a tasteless, unleavened cracker. You can put egg salad on it. You can put peanut butter and jelly on it. You can put whatever you want it in, but it is what it is. You don't eat leavened bread. No bagels, no sourdough, no really great stuff from Whole Foods or Fresh Time or your favorite bakery. Wow. And on the first and often the second night, people are invited for dinner. And people eat heartily and joyfully, and they celebrate. And I'm saving another piece for when I get to Easter. I cherished those experiences. I cherish them still today. And then we get to the 17th of April, which is Easter Sunday. Easter Sunday. It is interesting that when I joined the team this morning on Zoom, they were talking about their practice, about rehearsal for Easter Sunday. And I thought, yes, celebrating the triumph of Jesus over what appears to be death, the affirmation of our ongoing eternal existence within the energy that we call a loving God. All three of these religions are celebrating an undercurrent and underpinning event. Ramadan, as I said, is a period of time where people withdraw from food, from the pleasures that we have. You'll give up smoking and that sort of stuff, and constrain themselves in other ways so as to become more aware of the presence of God and God's infinite gifts. And the appropriate greeting to a Muslim friend or neighbor would be, may you have a good fast, meaning may you become more aware of God present in your life. May you experience God's blessings. And during Passover, people abstain from the joy of cake, cookies, leavened bread, anything that's been risen. And what are they celebrating? The exodus from Egypt, the release from the bondage of slavery. And of course, in Unity, we look at that as our release from error thought. And we go back to that reading that Mark read this morning, which says, I am God's life in expression. Each day brings me new light, new joy, and renewed awareness of my relationship to God. It is my good fortune to have wonderful memories of Easter. I grew up in an Eastern European family. My grandfather immigrated from Poland. 2 years later, he brought over my grandmother and their first 2 children. My mother was the first child born in the New World. And therefore, I grew up in a bilingual household. And though I can understand quite a bit of Polish today, I couldn't put a sentence together with a subject, predicate, object to save my soul. What I have discovered watching the news daily is how many words in Ukrainian are exactly the same words in Polish. That's been very interesting. We had wonderful customs, and the one that I cherished most, I think, is an expression that ties us all together because it was around food. On what is known as Holy Saturday, my grandma, while she was alive, and then my mother after my grandmother passed, would put together what we called a święconka. Don't even try and say that. It meant the blessed thing. And what we would do is take this basket that she had brought with her from Poland. It's amazing what people take with them when they immigrate, friends. There's great meaning in these treasures. And in it, she would put the food that we would eat first on Easter morning. So being Polish, of course, there would be kielbasa. There would be thick slices of ham. There would be bread, probably good Russian rye or pumpernickel. And because we would have been a very multi-ethnic environment, probably a good piece of Jewish challah as well. And there would be some other things in there, certainly colored Easter eggs. And often you would be able to buy a mound of butter in the shape of the Paschal lamb. You put all these things in this basket, covered it with a beautiful cloth, and took it to church, usually about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. In some places, you didn't do it in church if the weather was nice, which in Rochester early in March might not be so nice. People would put them on the lawn, the baskets on the lawn. And the priest would come out in his vestments, and with holy water, he would bless the food. And then you took it home. And then the next morning, that was the first food you ate before you tucked into scrambled eggs and anything else that you ate that morning. In each of these situations, friends, is very interesting. People are celebrating their connection, their relationship to God. That's their spirituality, this desire to be one with the energy, the allness of God that is the governing agency of our universe. We have often said, I live and move and have my being in the presence of God. And the food which sustains our physical beings, our bodies, and believe me, during these holiday celebrations, people eat really well because it is a symbol of God's enduring presence within us. We know from the human experience of death that when the spirit leaves us, the body is no longer the vehicle. It is the shell. But our confidence is restored to us, renewed within us in knowing that the eternal presence of God is the matrix within which we dwell. I use the word cherish, and I find that so significant. I believe that we need to cherish one another in our differences. And for that, I look at Bishop Spong's writing again. And he says, Beneath our religious diversity, there is a remarkable similar humanity. I am convinced that a religious unity that we have not dared hope for might now be dawning. Perhaps in the next 100 years, we will come to think of the religions of the world as being similar to one another as we today think the denominations of Christianity to be. So there are Roman Catholics, there are Protestants, there are Orthodox, there are evangelicals, there are fundamentalists, there are Mormons, there are Seventh-day Adventists. These expressions of Christianity, friends, are like subsets, like the subsets of Islam, where you have Shia, Sunni, Alawite, or Judaism, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform. These are the expressions of our individualized desires for being in union with God. To recognize this would be a major breakthrough in consciousness. And he says to me, such is not only possible, it is highly desirable. So we look at this month in which I have said humanity is celebrating its spirituality. I'm going to be teaching 3 classes this coming Wednesdays, each Wednesday at 11 a.m., and I'm calling it Feasting and Fasting with God. No, we're not going to be eating, but we will be exploring these 3 wonderful Abrahamic religions. I invite you to join me. So we look at this and we say, what is that to me? What is that to me? Friends, I found a description of a person in a book. I was reading a book. I'm not going to identify the book or the person, but it was sad to read it because the person was characterized this way. The person was devoid of empathy, incapable of humility, and unfamiliar with what it means to suffer consequences. And I thought, how sad to be a human being and be characterized in that way. We are not that. Through the power and the presence of God, we are people of empathy. Jesus' words to us were, love one another as I have loved you. And he didn't put any descriptive adjectives before one another. We are capable of humility. We are capable of humility when we say, not my will, but thy will, God. Meaning I choose to align myself with the perfect outcome of the world, with the divine order that is expressed in everything that occurs, whether we like it or not, whether we deem it good or bad. It is there for us to experience, to grow from, and to strengthen ourselves as individualized expressions of God. And lastly, it says, to be unfamiliar with what it means to suffer consequences. No, each one of us as a human being understands what it is to suffer the consequences of our choices. We look at our society today. We look at the state of our national health. I'm not going to get into the lecture on good food, bad food, fast food, whatever kind of food there is, but we are all living with the consequences of what happened every time we picked up a fork and put a mouthful into our being. Every time we've made a different choice, every time we've latched onto some ridiculous idea and held onto it forever in the face of evidence to the contrary, we know what it is to experience consequences. But when Spong says that it is highly desirable that we develop a breakthrough consciousness, I believe that unity already has and continues to unfold in that way. So going back to the very beginning of our little fireside chat, we talked about our customs, our experiences. If you have an opportunity to experience one of these other religions in some ways, please do. Okay, just buy a box of matzah. You won't regret it. You can always break it up for crumbs and use it in your baking. Maybe you could go out for dinner later in the evening to a Middle Eastern restaurant and see some families celebrating. Maybe they're there because they couldn't cook at home, or they had too many family to be in their house, so they're out. And if you're fortunate enough to have Jewish friends or neighbors, go and celebrate Passover. Celebrate that freedom from bondage. Celebrate the desire to be aware of God's presence. And on Easter Sunday, celebrate the message of our infinite life in God. I'm going to read one more statement by Spong, which will lead us into our meditation. He says, I sit consciously inside the experience of whatever the other, the divine, the holy is. And then I begin to incorporate that into myself. And I am able to live it out better than I would otherwise. I think that in some sense, God cannot be separated from who I am. And in parentheses here, we know that is the truth. God and I are one. We are one in God. He continues, God works through self-conscious human beings by calling us to live and to love and to be, and to create a world where others can live and love and be.